very warm welcome to all of you, partners, friends, colleagues. I'm Sophie Baranes, and I am the lead for the recovery practice at UNDP, United Nations Development Programme, Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience Team. It's my pleasure to welcome you. You know, this session is on financing transition and scaling long-term resilience at the community level. And as you can imagine, it's really timely, very timely and needed because the crises are not only more frequent, more extreme, more complex as well, with systemic risk, cascading impact, overlapping vulnerabilities. But this increase in frequency and intensity of this crisis, this really challenges our traditional approach to look at community resilience financing. Across humanitarian and development context, we know that communities continue to navigate overlapping shocks from climate-driven disasters to economic volatility, today food and oil price variation, displacement, conflict, protracted crisis. So this shock, and we know those shocks also disproportionately impact the most marginalized communities, the poorest communities. The climate breakdown accelerates this frequency and severity of shocks. At the same time, when communities have increased needs to access financing, to protect their assets, to sustain essential infrastructure and services, to adapt their economic activities to long-term stress and shocks. This is exactly when also at the same time the funding landscape is under increased stress, we all know. As community resilience remains chronically unfunded, it's getting worse, the needs are growing. And so humanitarian reform conversation, but also development fora, highlight this need to rethink how we can finance resilience and how we can finance community resilience at scale. Let me elaborate on some of the constraints to community resilience financing to provide some elements of context for our discussion. We know communities are not passive recipients of aid. They consistently demonstrate leadership, innovation, problem solving, even in the toughest circumstances. Yet our financing models often fail to reach or to empower communities. So it's really today's discussion is around this, our financing model. The constraints in those financing models are many. Already it's very difficult for community, local organization to access financing streams from across humanitarian development, but also the climate community. Especially because local organizations face disproportionate, let's say, due diligence and compliance obstacles we all know. Also, very often our donor-funded community projects have very short-term horizons. And this, obviously, this prioritization of quick wins does not really match with what has been, as a result of research. It is seen that we need to have some kind of 7-year investment cycle is needed to build lasting resilience. And of course, those timelines do not match. When it comes to access to private sector financing, we know private capital is abundant, but only a very small fraction of private sector investment is directed to community resilience investment, especially, of course, in fragile context, due to higher operating costs, but also the perception of high risk and low returns, which is sometimes just a perception because they can be really high return. Also, financing for community adaptation and resilience is then really often seen as too risky by commercial actors if there is no blended financing mechanism or public guarantees to actually reassure investors. One point on a micro and small enterprise, which in many countries account for the vast majority of businesses and also income and employment. Research shows that many of the small micro enterprises cannot access finance because of the strict collateral requirements imposed by banks and tenders. And this excludes the poorest of the communities. Finally, when it comes to financial inclusion, one last point for us to really think about throughout our discussion is really that many of our financing models fail to address social barriers, to address the gendered roles, the information gaps, but also the decision-making inequities. So this makes women, but also marginalized group in a situation where they cannot really equally benefit from access to finance when it's available. So this bias is also, we can also question this bias in the financing mechanism that are being proposed. So, of course, those are some barriers, but we also have some, let's say, reason to also have hope. Across contexts, we see a lot of examples of locally led mechanism. We see many more attempts to actually promote innovative partnerships with private sector. This is really growing. And to promote community-based financing approach, which are driven by the communities. So today's dialogue is an opportunity to really think what actors can do differently. When it comes, for instance, to the donor community, how can donor be better incentivized locally led action and reduce the transaction burden on community organization when accessing, national or global level funds? It's also for humanitarian and development partners, what type of financing or support have most tangibly enabled communities to pivot from coping to long-term resilience. And I think that's what we're going to hear some of our discussion today, share those experiences, right, from the ground. It's also about the private sector. What conditions would allow private sector to invest more confidently? How can we create those conditions? And then it comes to the government role, of course. How can national system, when we look at budgeting, when we look at the policies, the planning, the social protection system, the climate finance governance that is being, put in place at country level. How could those national systems also be strengthened to anchor community level resilience investments? And finally, I know that and that's the end, we know a big agenda for discussion today is also how can we move from those localized pilots, right? We have the most successful model, have been documented, but cannot really be scaled up because of lack of financing, but also maybe also because of insufficient institutionalization. So we have the proof of concept, but we miss the strategic thinking, the conducive environment to scale up success. So I think I had one point, but just today we're going to hear from practitioners, local organizations and partners who are testing new models, but also navigating these constraints that I was just describing. And the outcome of our exchange today will fit into our shared learning on finance mechanism to advance this locally led resilience. So with this, I kindly hand over to Natasha from the Charter Secretariat to take us through the session agenda and objectives and introduce the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophie, and good afternoon and welcome everyone. Thank you very much to UNDP, Sophie, and ECHO for co-convening this session with us today. My name is Natasha Westheimer. I'm the co-coordinator of the Secretariat for the Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations. And we're really pleased that this session is happening on Community Day. These conversations matter enormously to the Charter signatories, the 520 plus organizations that are working to integrate climate and environmental action into their humanitarian programming. As Sophie shared, the financing challenges are not new. Signatories have shared with us well before the challenges of the last year that structural gaps in resilience and climate financing have existed long before and are not just timely but urgent to address. Of course, there is something a bit strange having a conversation about long-term resilience while we're seeing urgent and immediate conflict unfold as we're sitting here, from Gaza and Beirut to South Sudan and the DRC. But I hope what we hear today from our speakers also reflects how working on community resilience can have co-benefits towards peace and security, and also can lay the foundations for more prepared responses and greening and environment and climate considered in immediate relief as well. From the Charter perspective, the financing conversation is a critical link between the Charter commitments and implementation. Without financing the commitments that signatories are making, the targets they're setting to integrate climate and environment into humanitarian action, to reduce risk, to support adaptive capacity, they simply cannot be delivered at the scale we need. Further, Commitment 5 of the Charter really highlights the role of collaboration across sectors and is also so directly relevant here, and why we think it's important that this session is convened by both the climate crisis area of common concern at HNPW and the HDP Nexus area of common concern. We hope that this session can bring together practitioners, as Sophie said, with different perspectives from different parts of from the sector and beyond about what actually works at the community level, what barriers persist, and what's really needed to scale this, especially in a time of a reset. We hope that these lessons can shape capacity sharing, can lead to some joint priorities to advocate for addressing some of the barriers and challenges, and that we can also continue to build the evidence base around how the humanitarian sector is supporting community resilience at large. We have an excellent panel today. We'll start off with a panel discussion and then open the floor to hear from others in the room. Sitting on our panel, we have online Vishal Pathak from the All India Disaster Mitigation Institute. Vishal was supposed to be here in person, and unfortunately, because of flight challenges and the Middle East crisis, he is joining us online, and we're so pleased to have him. Vishal is the project coordinator, project manager for small businesses, small towns, small adaptation, big resilience, a project where he's supporting resilience finance at the smallest but most critical scale in India. Anna Renfrew from the Resilience Learning Facility at Mercy Corps is here today. She'll present insights on the evidence they're building around what works and what doesn't related to financing resilience, particularly in fragile and conflict-affected settings. And Sasha Gayama from the Refugee Investment Fund at the Danish Refugee Council will be offering a perspective on innovative and alternative finance mechanisms for supporting long-term resilience for both the displaced populations they work with and the host communities that they're in. Following the panel, we, of course, would love to hear from our co-convener, ECHO. James Carey is a policy officer on innovation, private sector engagement, innovative finance, and digitalization at ECHO. He's joining us online and will provide a donor perspective to this conversation. And after that, we'll open it up to the floor, to those that are online, to those that are in the room, to share some lessons that you might have from financing resilience at the community level. And with that, Just a small housekeeping. Those in the room will be sharing mics when it comes time to participating. Those in the chat, those online, please share any questions you have in the chat, and we'll come to you at that time. And we'll be recording the session, sharing it online afterwards to please share with your colleagues. With that, I'll hand the floor over to Nishani. Nishani Jaimaha is my co-coordinator at the Secretariat for the Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations, and she'll be moderating today's panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for setting the scene, giving us some context, and also some of the priorities going ahead. Really, I think to kickstart this conversation, we're having these kind of the 3 lessons learned that we've really wanted to share and highlight today from what's happening on the ground. And I'm going to go straight and dive straight into it. You know, each of these initiatives that we've heard from, so we've got the small businesses, small towns, small adaptation, big resilience project that All India Disaster Mitigation Institute and Vishal's online, unfortunately, and not in person to share, the Resilience Learning Facility, and the Refugee Investment Facility that we're here to share a little bit more and unpack more. Each of these initiatives have taken different paths to financing community resilience, right? So, and I'm going to start with you, Vishal, online. Could you briefly share a little bit about your program in a few sentences? And what are the top most important lessons your work has taught you and your organization about making finance actually reach communities and actually to make it work? So I'm going to start with you, Vishal, on the question, and then head over to the other 2 speakers. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Hope my voice is reaching.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this really and inviting AIDMI. So our program focuses on strengthening the resilience of small businesses to extreme heat across 11 cities of India. And these businesses such as smaller repair shop, transport operators, home-based businesses, artisan, and micro manufacturers are highly exposed to extreme heat as well as also other co-located hazard, and often experience direct income loss during these extreme events. The program combines small adaptation investments, community-led actions making, and risk awareness support. The goal is to demonstrate how small locally managed financial support and knowledge can significantly reduce livelihood losses during extreme heat. And one of our top lesson is, what we have found that from AIDMI's engagement with 2,000 small businesses across these 11 cities, 73% demanded structured orientation session to better understand extreme heat and other climate-related risks, early warning system, and anticipatory actions. Part of it is also well said in the beginning context by Sophie that so this is what we evidence that coming out that 73%. So this demonstrate that communities are not passive recipients of aid. They want knowledge to act. Financing mechanism must therefore include, based on our experience on the ground, 4 points we have found. One is risk literacy and heat awareness. Second is early warning interpretation, access to early warning and its implications by that way. Third is anticipatory business planning. And fourth is peer learning platforms. This is really very important that how they learn from each other rather than someone from outside. So knowledge strengthens the impact of even small financial investments. Thank you, Nishan.
Thanks so much, Vishal. I mean, I think that really is some really crucial points there. Awareness raising on the risks in order for them to actually make the decisions and to really be prepared. That anticipatory action aspect of how do you make sure your businesses are resilient to increasing impacts and peer learning, I think is crucial. And this is something we also hear from our own charter signatories about how do we learn from each other. And I'm going to now turn to you, Anna, from your work. What are some of those top learning that you've the most important lessons in your work of what works, especially at community level?
Yeah, thank you so much. And the Extreme Heat program is incredibly impressive. So I think we all know that FCAS are currently underserved by global financial architecture, and that access to finance is a critical but underdeveloped pillar of resilience. So as part of the Resilience Learning Facility that I've been working on, we brought together sort of promising practices and evidence from a diverse range of FCAS contexts, and sought to show that even in the most complex settings, be that sort of high intensity conflict or constrained access environments, that building climate and community resilience through access to finance and market support is absolutely possible. We attempted to map feasible interventions relative to crisis levels and found that it's not necessarily just which interventions you're pursuing, but how they are delivered, and more importantly, how they're embedded into existing local systems. Take markets, for example. The local market sector actors are often continue to operate even when national supply chains or institutions have failed. They provide support to respond to shocks and stressors, and more people rely on sort of markets and community networks than receive humanitarian development aid. But in fragile settings, obviously they can be disruptive, costs can rise, access routes can change, and we really need to be adapted to that. I'll give a quick example from our SAFE program in Sudan. So the SAFE program operated a market systems development approach, linking farmers with seed distributors and microfinance institutions, village level agents. Through this program, yields had risen by 37% and had sort of particularly strong gains for women. But when the conflict erupted right at the beginning of the planting season, rather than setting up parallel humanitarian systems, the program pivoted and worked through existing private sector partnerships and community networks. This allowed them to move a lot of the seed distribution, decentralize the seed distribution, and set up and deliver subsidies to offset inflation. The program then adopted a split strategy. So in more stable areas, they've resumed commercial sales and credit, but in areas more affected by conflict, they maintained those subsidies to protect productive capacity. So the key lesson, I think, is in many of the fragile contexts we looked at, effective resilience finance isn't purely commercial or purely humanitarian. The most important thing is that it's adaptive and hybrid, and it protects market relationships and productive capacity so that during a crisis, recovery can begin immediately rather than starting from scratch.
Thanks. I think your point on really look at existing partnerships and build on those and not create parallel systems when the conflict flares up or we go back to insecurity. I think that's kind of crucial in this particular context that we heard from on the SAFE learning, and being adaptive and hybrid, right, at the same time, so that we're flexible. That's, I think, really interesting and important. And Sasha, maybe going to you on your refugee investment facility, slightly different or maybe similar-ish, would be really nice to hear a little bit about your facility and what this is about. And then also, how is that really looking at reaching communities and working for communities in a context of supporting displaced communities, host communities, etc.
Thank you. Yes, it is far more focused. The Refugee Investment Facility. It's a partnership that we've created with our investment partner called iGravity. It is a facility that is funded to the tune of $8.5 million, primarily through initial seed funding from ECHO, as well as from partner foundations. And on top of that, of those $8 million, of those $8.5 million, about $2 are from impact investors. So expecting a concessional level, but yet still a level of return on their investment. And so that is part of, again, this whole idea of trying to attract different types of funders beyond, obviously, humanitarian donors and grant providers. And what the facility does is that it issues impact-linked loans to SMEs. So SMEs that are operating in and around refugee hosting areas. The idea, again, to Anna's point previously, I think it's about working with what's already there, and what are there oftentimes are very dynamic SMEs that can't access finance for different reasons, that are operating despite the imperfect enabling environment, and yet are able to serve communities. What the RIF does through those impact-linked loans, and what impact-linked loans means is that it has an interest rate which essentially will go down if the enterprise realizes certain objectives towards being more inclusive of refugees. And so through that mechanism, we help incentivize these businesses who, again, are already operating there. And so we don't have to sort of convince them that there's a market there. They know there is one. But the idea is obviously to create an instrument that allows investment to come in rather than grants. And I think the general point is that as a sector, I think we are increasingly being asked to consider other forms of funding. I think it's less about thinking about it as a bucket that we need to fill, and more about what is the more appropriate form of funding available. Does it have to be grant funded? Just creating a bit more discipline around whether we think grants are the best way, and in many cases, frankly, it will still be the case. But if it's not, then what? And the RIF, the Refugee Investment Facility, is one answer to that. We created an investment vehicle with a specific financial product, right? But the idea is that this adds a further option to the options that are available, and that will ultimately, hopefully, help these businesses be, again, more inclusive of some of the people that we want to work with, in combination with the Danish Refugee Council's grant-funded activities around them. Thank you.
Thanks, and that's really important that looking at some of these blended models, right, that you're talking about, and how do we actually in context that we're working in, use grant funding, but at the same time use other modalities to access for longer term resilience, because our humanitarian funding is short term most of the time, and our grants are short term. So, I mean, I think that inclusion piece is really crucial. And I want to kind of touch back on that, and maybe for you, Anna, I'd like to ask you, what are those enabling the reaching the most marginalized in terms of FCAS context, right? Like what they're doing with the refugee work. Women, people with disabilities, elderly, displaced communities, these are the hardest to reach in context that we're working on. What are the priorities in your program that highlight them and give access to financing to these communities specifically?
Yeah, great question. Obviously, these interventions they can be adapted to different fragile contexts, and they absolutely need to be, because a sort of one-size-fits-all model is just not going to work. But they can only do that if they are grounded in a really nuanced understanding of how shocks affect market systems and how those systems affect different groups differently. So one example I can think of is from Afghanistan. So following the Taliban takeover, the financial system had collapsed. There was broken banking infrastructure, very high costs, and very limited internet activity. And we had worked with farmers, which we then found very difficult to get resources to them. So we partnered with a blockchain company, and don't ask me to explain how blockchain works, but a blockchain company called Hesab Pay and a local Afghan NGO to get funding to those farmers with digital wallets. So they didn't need internet access, they didn't need smartphones or even sort of prior experience with digital payments. They could use those cards to purchase medicine, food, agricultural inputs, and then vendors could cash out essentially at local branches using satellite synced technology. Another example is the RIPA program from Ethiopia. Access to financial services was incredibly limited for a lot of pastoralist communities we were working with, and also with many women that we were working with as well. Many of the communities were skeptical around interest-based financial products because of religious reasons. So we worked with local partners to explore Sharia-compliant financial products to increase uptake and access to those services. The mobile and often scattered nature of some of the pastoralist communities we were working with also meant that sort of traditional banking branches were really unviable. So we switched to mobile money agents and digital wallets. For women, I mean, I have to stress how important trust has been in enabling more women to become savers and borrowers. So working through often informal savings groups or community networks has been really critical, but also adopting things like group loans options or reducing collateral requirements or even just employing female money agents have all been really helpful. So I think that it's important to understand when we're tailoring some of these products that finance needs to be adaptive and, most importantly, behaviorally informed. So as I said before, strengthening rather than replacing local systems and actually aligning with how people already use and access money. Yeah.
Thanks. And I think this is a really good question. And to Vishal, I'm looking to you on this, because the work you're doing on heat waves is also targeting very specifically vulnerable communities, right, who are impacted by heat. So would be really good to have the same question to you in terms of the work you're doing in the cities. How is that really looking at in terms of how do you target the most vulnerable communities, and then in terms of what is missing and why is that missing as well? Over.
Thank you for interesting question, as well as also challenging to respond while responding to demand on the ground, whom to cover and how and whom to not. It's really very challenging. So out of 2,000 businesses engaged in this program, 66% are women-led businesses. So this program supported participation through local consultation and practical workplace adaptations. Such as like shared structure, improved ventilation, hydration access, also against flood risk and cyclone, and adjusting in working hours, especially in the case of extreme heat. So these simple but practical measures helped many vulnerable businesses owners, including women-led businesses, elderly workers, and persons with disabilities, reduce heat exposure and continue operating during extreme heat conditions. So while assessing these businesses, we have have this our list, whom to cover, when, how, based on the assessment. And what we ensured is women-led consultation spaces. We found very interesting and important. Priority inclusion in support mechanism and accessible orientation session. tailored workplace adaptations. In terms of, at the same time, there are still group we are not able to cover within this 2000 small businesses, such as domestic workers, caretakers, and highly mobile livelihoods. What we found that reaching them requires different approaches and processes than those used for small businesses located in market areas. So we always have this limitation in terms of time and resources and that. So this group, like domestic workers and caretakers, their work settings are more disparate and not connected to market locations, which makes it difficult to design, implement, and monitor workplace adaptation measures in the same way. Yes, so this indicates that separate engagement models will be needed to support resilience for this group as well. Thank you.
Thanks, and that goes to, interestingly, and even in the FCAS context of the tailored, how do you actually tailor make some of these? So this is really quite nuanced in terms of when you're looking at a facility, when you're actually looking at very specific types of communities, how to reach them, how for them to get access to these financing. It needs to be quite specific because of the different challenges or accessibilities of each of them, right? And I think on that, Sasha, with the RIF, I mean, you are actually targeting refugee populations and displaced populations. So in that context, is there any, what are the enabling conditions in this context that you're working with the RIF that needs to be put in place perhaps for access to the most vulnerable populations for financing like this? Hearing from some of what we've been hearing from the other two speakers.
Well, first, I'm glad that FCAS has made it to the mainstream. You don't need to break it down. And in many ways, it's, well, for those who don't know, fragile and conflict-affected situations, which in some senses, I would say the new nexus, and does, well, anyway, it's a side point. I mentioned in passing imperfect enabling environments, and I think it's important to be able to work on two speeds, so to speak. There's clearly a long-term perspective in terms of access to investment and finance where you do need to help the enabling environment, which is the legal frameworks, policy frameworks. When it comes to refugees, for example, I think the right to work and the right to move are critical factors, or any kind of investment that we would like to do would frankly not work. Or not be as impactful, at least. But you do need to be able to do that. But you also need to work, again, to Anna's point, with what's there, with the people and the system as it currently exists. And for that, you do need financing that is adapted to that, even if you're talking about things that are beyond grants. And again, the RIF is an example of that, but there are many other types. And I think, broadly speaking, I do think that there are still, as we are in this, I wouldn't say early stage, but middle stage of diversifying funding strategies in the humanitarian sector, that there's still a bit of an insufficiency, well, many insufficiencies, but one of them being, the variety of financial instruments, I think, is still quite insufficient between what's grant and non-grant. I think, for those who are familiar with UN Capital Development Fund, I think they said it quite interestingly, like the white space of capital, which I think is, in many ways, it espouses a lot of what we at the Danish Refugee Council also look a lot in terms of how do you want to mobilize finance in these FCAS places. Then one of these things is being able to provide capital that works across that continuum of capital between grant and non-grant, and what does that look like? I don't think there's enough. Again, the RIF, impacting loans, that's one. It works for certain things. It doesn't work for other things. And so in some sense, we are widening that range, or at least, and, this is probably a third point, but maybe get into that later, but ultimately we don't all had to do everything all at once, and that includes us. One of the reasons we created the RIF was that we felt that there was a gap. People often talk about the missing middle, and when it was especially missing when it came to displacement affected areas, business operating there, and the fact that we felt the need to incubate something that even locally managed funds were not actively targeting was part of that effort. And as an example of that, one of our first investments is a company called Omiya Agribusiness, and I think they've gotten a lot of airtime recently, which is great because from a first investment in grant that they received in grants, we were their first commercial investment through the RIF, impact-linked loans, and since then they have secured further follow-on investment from institutional investors like Acumen. So I think that just demonstrates this long-term perspective that you're able to do, but you have to be able to work on two speeds, really. Some organizations like UNDP would be better placed for the macro level conversation, policy, enabling environment, all that. But you also need to be able to work with the system as it is and the financing tools that are appropriate for that.
Thanks, and that really is interesting. You talked about the missing middle and where there was no one else taking the risk that this was set up because of that gap, right? That big gap. And I think I'm going to turn to you, Anna, on this in terms of that shift that's required. Now in our title, it's about scaling, right? So what that shift from actually doing these programs that are very tailored, very specific to the context, and then trying to scale that, which is the hardest part, right? That's what everyone asks. Well, we are hearing donors saying, what's the evidence? How can we scale? We don't want to give money for a little project because then it'll start and then it'll stop and then won't, we can't scale it. It's very difficult to start another pilot and another pilot. So I think my question to you then is, in this particular moment of time when we are looking at the humanitarian reset, funding crunch, budget cuts, how do we really look at that scaling at local level and locally led level? And what are those shifts that you see is really required to happen? Over to you.
Yeah, that's a really hard question. I was asked that on a panel yesterday and I didn't have a solution, so sorry. But I think in terms of a shift that we need is much greater flexibility built into our programming than we currently have. That is useful because it allows that we are investing to be better able to cope with and adapt to crises as they occur, and for communities to sort of lead that process and identify what their needs are. So yeah, I think that's really important. But I think the flexibility from the donor side as well, we need to be more comfortable having less oversight on some of this funding and hopefully be more comfortable maybe delivering smaller envelopes of funding that can directly fund some of the maybe adaptation actions or development planning that is happening at the sort of subnational, local, provincial level. I think we're all celebrating some of the amazing climate planning that's coming out of different states, so LAPAs, CAPs, whatever. But quite often we then are like, okay, that's amazing. How is that funded? So I think having a system where those subnational actors can directly access some of the funds available will be really important in scaling. Yes, I can't remember if there was another part to your question.
It's okay. We'll come back. We'll come back. There's I think a lot of space for further unpacking some of this. And Vishal, I want to kind of go to you because in the context you're working in India, it's slightly different to what we're talking about in fragile and conflict affected context, right? But the challenges remain the same. The heat wave problem of the challenge of heat waves is a commonality, a similarity in so many contexts we're seeing where there's heat waves being impacting refugees, displaced communities, etc. And I think for you the same question of scaling for you at your level, but also Do you see in South Asian contexts and including in fragile contexts that this sort of a model that you're working on, could it be scaled, and what kind of might be those, what works, what may not work?
Interesting. Yes. Well, immediate answer is yes. Just about these small businesses, more or less some percentage change, but many countries in Asia have, uh, around 30 to 40% GDP contribution comes from this such small businesses. So even the types of businesses and their behavior may change, but their contribution is really high, and same way their exposure to such extreme heat and other climate risk is very high. So yes, with contextual adaptation, these models works because it is low cost. These adaptation measures link with their day-to-day risk realities. It is very decentralized because which adaptation measures and their selection link with their market, link their locations, are very much decision led by the small businesses. And as said, behavior focus is another one very important area. Um we need to avoid, in such cases, high dependency on the infrastructure point of view because of their background, and based on the local ownership while taking this decision, which adaptation measures, when and what, like that way. In fragile conflict affected contexts where systems are disrupted, small enterprises based adaptation can in fact help in terms of stabilize local market, reduce livelihood collapse, and also maintain supply chain in terms of contribution point of view. Over to you, Nissan. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And we're talking of scale, but you talked of decentralization. So that's, sometimes it might sound like a contradiction to a certain extent, right? Because sometimes scale means you centralize it and see how can you scale it fast or more. I don't know. That's kind of what comes up to my mind when I think of scaling. Perhaps maybe I'm wrong, but I think, Sasha, I'd like to turn to you on this. In terms of the work you're doing, what sort of, and that's kind of really linked to the scaling piece. Do you see this in other contexts doable? What does an organization like DRC need to put in place, or an organization like you then, DRC and others who want to do something like this need to put in place then to do this sort of scaling, or do another pilot of it, or not a pilot, but
Thanks. I think that's the multi-billion-dollar question there. Ultimately, why? How can we get more? And I think it does. I don't necessarily think it's a contradiction. In fact, I think it's very much the essential challenge of trying to do this in fragile contexts where people talk about big amounts, but the reality of FCAS is that you do have to operate at a fragmented scale, and that is the nature of it. Context-specific funding at big scale. How do you let 1,000 flowers bloom? And I think a lot of the thinking conventionally has been around, we need to find the right intermediaries. And I think what the more emergent thinking is that we need a wider range of intermediaries. But at the same time, you enter into this inevitable tension, right, between how many intermediaries is too many intermediaries before you've sort of intermediated the hell out of the whole thing. So I think that is a live consideration. I think there are many things that can, and I say this, the RIF is not the only thing that we do, and it is not the only way we try to contribute or accelerate a more locally led action. I mean, we work with SMEs that are, like I said, already there, and we try to make sure that they're inclusive of people of concern, whether it's access to goods or access to finance. But it is clearly a much bigger piece. I think to the idea that we can channel more finance, I think what really needs to change beyond, there are these macro things that I think are possibly beyond what we want to talk about today. But I think it really boils down to being able to be a better partner locally. I think the reason we create the RIF and the reason more and more people are finding ways to fund in different non-grant types of funding is that they have created instruments and tools that allow them to be relevant for the people in their context in a different way, and that includes business. And in terms of what else needs to change beyond the environment and the ability to have these tools, there is a capacity element, and I know we talk a lot about. I hear a lot. Well, I hear less and less, but I still hear, and it's not untrue. I think this idea that you need to speak the language of the private sector, it's not untrue. But that just gets you into the room, and then so step two, magic happens, is not the way it works. You kind of have to have a shared understanding of what you bring to the table, and it takes two to tango. I think this is probably a third point. The private sector, I think, at large, it's hard to talk about them in a big bucket, but broadly speaking, I think the attitudes have changed a lot. Perhaps not enough, but certainly have changed a lot in my experience in terms of private sector actors being more willing to have the conversation. Until very recently, 5 years ago, I would say, and we've been at this for over 5 years, the conversation could halt very quickly. Like, we're all, where's my return on investment? And if we're not talking about business, why are we here? I think there's now more openness to, okay, let's find a creative way to be more relevant in these spaces. That doesn't guarantee you get there, and that sort of means that I think I think Sophie, as you described, like friction is still a reality, especially in FCAS. When people talk about transaction costs, that's kind of what they mean. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of analysis, a lot of due diligence, all these things to get it done. And if you're not talking the same language, it makes it even more difficult. So what you really need to do, to boil down the point, really again, you need to build your ability to be a better partner. Language is a starting point, but it's not enough. I think some form of capacity to do that, to make sure that you're not system blind, but also not value blind. And I think this is the sort of a critical point in terms of financing. If you know what your action does, whether it's how it attracts more money, more capital of different forms for directly into communities' hands, or via a business or whatever intermediary locally makes sense, or if you understand, in a completely different topic on anticipatory action, if you know that through my work I'm avoiding these costs, how can I create this shared value with someone else and build a contextually relevant collaboration model so that we all know what we're bringing again to the table here. Ideally, you want to get to a stage, I'm making a fourth and final point that I wasn't expecting, which is all this sounds very artisanal, like, very lots of, and it is true, and it's especially true in FCAS, but I think it's important to realize that we are also in this sort of middle stage where we're now entering into people wanting to be more standardized about this, less reinventing of the wheel of partnerships. And again, there is also
Testing.
I'll briefly, 20 seconds to finish my point. I think there is that tension of now we want to do these things more systematically, but we realize in fragile context that it is quite a frictional process, but but almost necessarily because of the nature of fragile context. So this natural tension of how much do you want to standardize things to make sure that we do this much easier versus really the importance of being as contextual as possible, working with local actors through them and with them, and frankly, primarily through them, is kind of I feel the current stage of the next tension that you need to navigate if you want to make these things work at scale.
Okay, that I'm just wondering because of our tech. Just Vishal, can you hear us online?
Yes, now yes. In between, I lost voice.
Okay. So right. So we need to use the mic likely, and maybe Vishal, just before so that we can manage the tech. It's not working. Yeah. So maybe Vishal, maybe one of the things I really wanted to come back to you was on the community ownership piece, because I think that is really for all of the facilities. What does that community ownership look like, and how does that really enable that resilience building and that financing to really work on the ground? I think is key. Just over to you for that.
So for this purpose, we have, designed in a way that how and when we should have this interaction with these small businesses so that we can capture this what works and where we need to modify our processes. But after these adaptation measures, while tracking them, we have found that 75% of these small businesses reported feeling more prepared, and we also had some field consultations, and we found that these measures sustain their ownership help when it is about decision are locally led, like which adaptations they are going to select, it is decided by them. Sometimes it requires some orientation, but ultimate decision taken by these small businesses, and that's really helpful because that's bring ownership. Many times after these adaptation measures, they're taking the entire maintenance of their adaptation measures, as well as also reinvest by their own once it is stabilized. So that's really help us because of this field practices and processes. Another one is about the solutions aligned with daily economic realities. So this extreme heat aspect during summer season, but also afterwards it is also about the heavy rain and flood situation, and sometimes beyond than that. So this from the small business perspective, their perception of their risk and economic reality is also very important that we consider in these practices. And third and last is the financing is flexible and adaptive in terms of time, and in its processes business to business. So many businesses we have found that they reinvest their own funds once stabilized, demonstrating confidence in the measures. Small adaptation intervention often provide a better economic value for these small business owners than relying on high interest informal borrowing, risky loans. Thank you.
Thanks, Vishal. I think with the interest of time, and we yeah, we'll
Sorry,
go
again
on.
missing your voice.
Can you hear us now?
Now, yes.
Perfect. Okay, sorry, we are having some technical issues. That's nothing new, I guess, but happens. So we are going to. I'm going to hand over to Natasha now to take on the next part of our conversation. That's over to you, Natasha.
Thanks, Nishani, and thanks to the panelists so far for sharing some really interesting insights. I now want to turn the conversation to James Carey, who's online, and I will pin you for everyone to see. James, as a reminder, James is the Policy Officer on Innovation, Private Sector Engagement, Innovative Finance, and Digitalization at DG ECHO. James, in this era of humanitarian funding focusing on life-saving needs, donors are looking at increased efficiency in the humanitarian sector, doing more with less. And also, we know that ECHO is a big supporter of working towards resilience and thinking innovatively about what does that look like. And we've heard a few of these innovative approaches already, and I'm wondering if you can share from the perspective and learning at ECHO, what have you seen about, and what do you have to say about how traditional humanitarian donors can support organizations in the long run to build resilience at the most local level, supporting the most vulnerable communities we work with. Over to you, James.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, thanks for including me, and great to hear about all the different projects and initiatives that are going on. You're right to say that humanitarian donors, the humanitarian community, I mean, we're refocusing on, there's more focus on life-saving needs with the kind of funding crisis, if you like, that's happening. But it's not just that. It's, I mean, even when we had relatively more resources, the needs that there were already outstripped them. So it's not, while we're doing this efficiency drive, it's not just a question of efficiency. I think there's a recognition across donors that will, even the most efficient system acting the same way as before will never meet the amount of needs that there are in the world with donor resources alone. So there's a couple of things that we are trying to do as donors, donor community, but also as DG ECHO, to really kind of reinforce the system and make it more fit for purpose, if you like, or future-proof for to move beyond this immediate phase of focusing on the life saving and look for the day after, really. So yeah, we do of course want to be more efficient, make the system work better, be smarter with our funding, so reduce the amount of duplications, be more anticipatory and risk informed. But I think there's this whole other piece of work which is around reducing needs and working on the core drivers of need together with various other actors, climate, development, peace, diplomatic, etc., to address or to work better, rather, because it's probably a bit unlikely to say we will address it exactly, but to work better in fragile contexts through a whole of government effort, if you like, and to increase resilience. So the conversation today, I think, is really playing into that broad stream of thinking, and something that we are preoccupied with. The Commission is obviously aiming to do the efficiency bit, but we're also working with counterparts across government, across the Commission, but across humanitarian development, climate, peace factors in both ours and counterpart governments, to bring solutions in fragility to support resilience. We're launching a new fragility strategy as the EU later this year. As part of that, we're also, as a big part of that, linking into today's discussion, is encouraging particularly development banks to start taking resilience and community level resilience far more into account in fragile and conflict affected settings, and to leverage the instruments. I mean, I think Sophie at the start mentioned the need for de-risking, and how do we leverage these instruments which do exist, but on a kind of large development scale, how do we leverage them better in some of the more fragile contexts? So I think this is the thrust of a lot of our work at the macro level. And then in addition to that, we're trying to bring in this resilience dimension into our, if you like, regular programming, traditional funding. Now, the question was really about what do we do? How do we make this resilience dimension stronger? I've heard a lot of suggestions coming out of the previous presenters, which across the board kind of agree with. We've got a lot of normal means at our disposal. Things that I heard include like longer contracts, longer time frames, more predictable funding, but also more flexibility within funding to allow partners to experiment almost a bit more, or to see what works in terms of making partnerships and making resilient solutions. Also, integrating resilience and links to development and from the shorter term assistance to longer term into the project design, so that we're always thinking not only about life saving, but the days and the years after. These are all parts of our programming as it exists, and ones that we're obviously constantly trying to push. Not just our partners, but also colleagues on the operational side to make more use of, so that we can more easily inject some of these longer term elements which benefit from more flexibility. I think there's a narrative consideration about where, which places do we want to focus on when we're encouraging resilience. And I think fragility is one way of expressing it. I think also this idea of transitions, so places where there's been aid going, year after year, protracted situations, but which are no longer the most urgent, the live emergencies. And this idea of moving away from humanitarian assistance and towards development support or government support or market-based solutions. What we are trying to do as a donor is encourage our partner organizations to develop solutions that really bridge this gap between emergency and longer term resilience, that do things like engage the local private sector more, look more to the long term, have established links with development funders, development actors. And this can already be done in if you like, our regular funding program, but there's also in the background of a lot of the things that we've been talking about today, this question of innovative financing instruments. And I think Sasha mentioned it directly about moving away from grants, or not just having grants, but moving towards using other financial instruments, which is not straightforward for us to do as a donor. We have a regulatory framework which prohibits us in certain ways of how we can give money to our partners, but it's one we are trying to encourage as much as possible, because effectively finance almost inherently encourages this longer term thinking, the need to factor resilience and sustainability considerations into project design because of the need to reimburse or to pay back on the principal. It also facilitates this engagement of private actors. We cannot in a lot of situations, it's going to be difficult to engage properly with local private actors without having a finance dimension, using only grants. And I think that the other important aspect of finance, and why we're really encouraging our partners to bring more finance elements into their projects that we're receiving, is that it allows for this link to development programming, to development banks, and because this is the kind of language. Sasha talked again about the language of the private sector, but I think also we need to think as humanitarians about the language of the development sector as well. And this is where finance and the long-term sustainability and business plans and so on that it entails is the language that they're speaking, and what we're necessarily going to have in our projects if we want to have this link towards the large-scale investment projects that we're trying to link with. So we funded pilot projects, including the RIF, as Sasha mentioned, various different mechanisms. And I think we found a couple of things I just want to kind of leave out there for the audience. I think, first of all, the partnerships dimension is critical. I don't think we should think that humanitarian organizations can go it alone, or would have the necessary expertise, or even should develop all this kind of expertise. We really have found that partnering between different types of organization, different categories of stakeholder, with private investors, or with development banks, or just with even kind of development actors themselves, or development donors, is the way that we can have a more holistic and comprehensive approach to integrating resilience into our programs. So we're encouraging our partners to build these partnerships with investors and the other actors I mentioned. And I think there's a possible added value for us as a donor, and not just us, I mean the donor community, to do more to stimulate these partnerships. So this is one of the main activities we're looking at, is how to bring some of the projects like we've heard about today to the attention of the wider investment and development communities, and to basically work on them together and to co-create these new partnerships. That goes hand in hand with the fact that we have to recognize that humanitarian donors particularly don't have, I mean, we can play a catalyzing role. We don't have the money really to fully fund the scale up phase of a lot of these projects. So it should probably come from development actors or markets, but where we can do something is in providing the startup or seed funding that can get the ball rolling and help attract other investors. If we want to do more of that, if we want to build a business case that we should be using our funding more as catalytic and more to help de-risk these kind of projects, then we need, on the flip side, actors to be looking at the narrative and measurement aspects. Building the business case for humanitarian funding to be used in that way, rather, I mean, it's not necessarily a zero-sum game with life-saving, but are compatible. That there's space for that resilience funding is at minimum equal to not having to provide life-saving funding down the line, but actually can also have an impact on needs right now. And then, like, finally, the gap to the development actors, I think we need to really look at how we can address this. Engaging with development banks, development funders, so in the EU's case, it's EU delegations on the ground, and mapping out how our humanitarian resilience focused programmings integrate with some of the broader funding that they're doing is key, I think, to building this continuum of scale up for funding from pilots to systemic solutions, which is mentioned by others. So we're working on all of these things at the Commission, including through expanding our innovative financing possibilities, and leading the engagement that I mentioned, between private actors, humanitarians, development actors. As part of our forthcoming communication, we're aiming to launch a new initiative on stepping up partnerships and investment, including a possible high-level event on this in the autumn. So hoping that we can take some of the lessons learned at events like this and other places into those discussions and really help to mainstream them into the thinking of the wider donor and also investor community. Thanks.
Thanks, James. And I think that your ECHO's involvement in a session like this is one, we're very grateful for that. And I hope that these sessions and the conversations can also help build the evidence base that you said we need in order to support donors in providing some of these seed grants or support to scale this work. We've got about 15 minutes left, and in the next little bit, we're saving a few minutes at the end for a bit of a wrap up. But we want to hear from folks either online or in the room about maybe you have a question for a panel, or maybe you want to answer to the question that James put forward. If you have one lesson learned, one insight that you'd like to share for others to take away on financing and scaling community-led resilience. I'll take a couple of hands from the room and online. We have Diego online, and I see 1, 2 in the room. Let's start with those 3, and then we'll see if we have time. We'll first just take someone in the room, then we'll go to Diego, and then we'll come back to one person in the room.
Hi, this is Frances Crowley from the Disasters Emergency Committee, and I just wanted to share an example from our work. I think the DC offers a model of quite collaborative and flexible funding. For those who don't know us, we are a consortium of the UK's leading humanitarian agencies, and we fundraise collectively from the British public. Our funds are then divided up amongst our members, and They're really quite flexible. They can be used up for between 2 and 3 years. And we really encourage our members to integrate climate and environment, resilience, adaptation, DRR into both the emergency and recovery phase of our funding. I wanted to give an example today of something that we have, which is a collective initiative, which enables, we basically make funds available for members to do a bit of more of a deep dive into different areas such as resilience building, localization, DRR. And yeah, I guess this kind of speaks to the pilot element that people have been mentioning today. And one example of this is from Lebanon, where two of our members, Oxfam and ACF, have been carrying out a project aimed at improving and monitoring access to safe water in FCAS. And yeah, it's about using technologies that are really available and accessible to local communities and bringing that local ownership of these so that local communities are able to monitor water access points and report emergencies in real time. And yeah, using this kind of low-tech and accessible technology. And yeah, it's really kind of making water access much more equitable in these areas. Speaking to the scaling up of that, I think, yeah, these are kind of pilot level projects, but having a broader membership where lessons can be shared and learned throughout, I think is a good starting point. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Frances. I think the sharing lessons learned is a big piece there, and we're hoping that this session, and there's a lot of learning that we have as a sector, and how can we do better at sharing, I think is an important takeaway. Diego, I know that Dan Churchade was hoping to be here, and we're so glad that you're able to join us online. I know the Zimbabwe Resilience Fund, I pronounced that wrong. I said that wrong. The Zimbabwe Resilience Building Fund is doing a lot in this space, and I'm wondering if you can share with us one lesson that you have from your work engaging across different actors and supporting long-term resilience that might be useful to add to this conversation.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm Diego from Dan Churchade. We have been implementing the Zimbabwe Resilience Building Fund. We put lots of emphasis on empowering local communities and supporting existing local government structures and community level platforms. So we want to see a shift from merely supporting livelihoods to facilitating market-based approaches that link small communities to business, small business to larger formal markets, leveraging on private sector models. So we have been providing access to loans for small, medium enterprises in Zimbabwe, those that cannot access finance because of lack of collateral here and there, and that is imposed by banks and SMEs. So we have been working on those small enterprises, and we partner with the Zimbabwe Agricultural Development Trust to create a guarantee fund to get guaranteed collaterals that provide access to loans with low interest rates. So that's one model that we have used, and we also put another model where we did tripartite arrangement, where private sector comes in to work with communities and the rural district councils. We bring together private and public sector to establish maybe a big slaughterhouse or abattoir that generates income continuously for communities. How does that work? So we invested 50% of our income, and also under 50% comes from the private sector. And the abattoir now is self-sustaining and generates revenue. So in terms of lessons, a quick lessons is DC has acted as a facilitator to bridge private and public sector and communities. We have realized that civil society organizations can play a pivotal role in bridging the trust gap between communities and private sector by facilitating dialogue, strengthening capacities, and supporting development of viable enterprises. I also realized that there's huge information asymmetry that places smallholder enterprises at a disadvantage, as they often lack access to essential information around financing and market instruments such as credit scores, credit registries, credit insurance, collateral registries, etc., etc. And we then come in as a civil society organization to bring that to work. So also the absence of real-time delivery services, very important in business, and business diagnostic tools for entrepreneurs highlights the need for development of accessible online business support and advisor platforms. That's also very important to look at. There's also need, that's what we realize, to provide complementary to the project, need for legal assistance to support the establishment of registered community trust that can then become formalized and be able to access funding on their own. Right? And also need is even to support communities to develop their own business case and bring the private sector closer to the community. Because, in most cases, the private sector is not keen in getting closer to communities that are marginalized, that are far-fetched, that are away from where business happens. But we try to get that confidence to happen between the private sector and the very marginalized communities. We also do skills development, very important, to ensure that the capacity development for communities is important as well, that they have financial management skills, saving and lending skills, ensure the viability of communities and the investment that they put on. So the relationship that's very important, between private sector and disadvantaged communities is often skewed due to mistrust and the perceived lack of bankable projects within the community. So we then come in as DCA to bridge that gap, so that there's confidence between the private sector and communities to work on projects that could be bankable, that could be sustainable beyond the life of projects that we run as DCA.
Thanks, Diego.
Thank you. That's what I can say.
And just to say, I mean, what I keep hearing is the very different roles that humanitarians are playing in facilitating this process, whether it's, as you said, a convener, as a trust builder, connector, or facilitating and leading the process directly, as we heard from Vishal at AIDMI. The different roles, I think, is an important illustration of how so many organizations can tap in and access innovative finance, or think about supporting long-term resilience and financing it at scale, and that organizations can play different roles in doing so. We'll take one more intervention from the audience, and then we'll wrap up, because we're reaching the end of our session. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Willeke van Rijn from the Resource Alliance. We are a global community of over 30,000 fundraisers, campaigners, mainly from civil society organizations. Of course, when we're talking with those fundraisers in civil society organizations, diversity in fundraising is key. Even diversifying away from fundraising towards new financing models, Sasha, what you were mentioning about as well, and it's a very common thing. What we really hear as one of the lack of implementing new examples and what is out there is actually a lack of knowledge. So that knowledge sharing is really crucial. We have a lot of examples around organizations starting even social enterprising models to diversify their income, but also looking at alternative models, and we are happy to share them, but also new ideas. I think that awareness creation, what is out there, not from a theoretical perspective, but really the lived experiences and the people behind the ideas, is really crucial to replicate it fast. And it has too much, especially on the financing models, been there as a theoretical approach instead of this is really how we can now start implementing it. Another topic that we've completely not spoken about yet is individual givers. Individual givers is massive everywhere across the world. If you're looking at Asia, hundreds of millions in the middle class and hardly tapped upon. And it really results into long-term funding often, which is an interesting opportunity to tap into as well. And we see the arrival of new family trust coming out of that. So also the individual giving part is really crucial. And then last but not least, if you're looking at financial resilience of civil society organizations, also there, impact investment might be a model that really works. So we have been lobbying for an impact investment fund in financial resilience for civil society organizations, because once you have a working model that easily could be funded by impact investment and doesn't require donations alone. So really looking at breaking the cycle and making it available for many instead of one by one might be opportunities. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Really interesting perspectives from the audience, and I wish we had another hour to keep talking. But what I will say is that the insights that we have as a sector are really important. And as I said at the beginning, particularly in this moment, as we're literally today having conversations about the reset and how we can contribute to the conversation of what the reset looks like. I will say at 4 o'clock at Salle 4, there is a conversation about climate. Salle 2, we're in Salle 4, sorry. Salle 2, a conversation hosted by the ISC climate group on the climate and greening aspects of the reset, that I hope that the learnings and knowledge and sharing from this session and beyond, you can bring into that space as well. I'll now hand over the microphone to Nico Dominguez Carrero, who's working with us at the Secretariat and has been a rapporteur of the session to provide a summary of some key takeaways. And then Sophie, if you can wrap us up afterwards, that would be great.
Thank you, Nita. Oh, hello. Yeah. Hi, y'all. Thank you all. I think three things stood out to me listening to the conversation today. First is that resilience finance really must be locally embedded and inclusive. I think this means addressing both the local context and what already exists, but also thinking inclusivity much broader than just the really important work with women and other marginalized stakeholders, but perhaps the private sector, development actors, who are we bringing into the room? Second, that knowledge and trust are critical enablers. Again, this goes both ways. It's both perhaps capacity building for communities, but I think back to our colleague from Yemen who addressed Tom Fletcher this morning and asked if perhaps the UN also needs capacity building. It sounds like our donors may also need some capacity building as well. Third is that flexibility and innovation in financing are essential. I think both the colleague in the crowd and our colleagues up here have shared about moving away from perhaps just traditional fundraising to considering some of these alternatives might be very important, as well as being comfortable with perhaps fragmentation and less traditional oversight. Ultimately, it seems that financing is not just about mobilizing resources, but designing mechanisms that strengthen and empower local communities to take ownership. And I think it's important to keep this in conversation with the larger humanitarian reset, where some of the solutions presented today don't sound all that different from just the larger problems that the sector is grappling with. And I'll also pause to plug the charter, where we are doing a lot of this important work to capture an expertise and share some of the impact to build the evidence base that this work is already happening, and we just need support to scale it up. And with that, I'll pass it to Sophie.
Well, I'm grateful to all of you for joining us today, and of course to our speakers. But I'm especially also grateful. I would like to thank the Charter Secretariat for designing, organizing the session, managing to actually mobilize super interesting contributions. So congratulations to us, but to you in particular. So a big thank you to Natasha, Nishani, and Nico. I also had some 5 takeaways, but they are very similar to you. So maybe I just use 2, but one, I really like the recommendation to rethink the financing product between grants and loans, because it's still very, in the end, a very initial, this work. And we need to be pushed in that direction, as our ECHO colleague, mentioned. So we look forward also to this discussion in October with ECHO. And I also really liked the finance need to be behaviorally informed. I felt, actually different colleagues touched on it. Also investing in more research to understand better differentiated impact on markets and population groups. So with that, thank you so much. And then more exciting session to come still. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And
Really
thank you as well
appreciate
to all of our panelists online and in person, contributions from the audience, UNDP, ECHO.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.